Now, before we go on to spelling out the Islamic alternative, let's just talk about interest one final time in terms of, what are the justifications for it? Because a lot of people, they'll read economics at university and they'll have these justifications for it, and they'll say, actually, you've got it wrong. It's not that bad a thing. It really helps. So can you tell us a little bit about what are the common justifications for interest?
Even historical justifications, because I think this has been a question that has been going on for a while, actually.
Yes.
In a way, it was more in the Western culture many hundreds of years ago when they still had an attachment to Christianity to somewhat.
Yes.
I mean, nowadays we don't even hear about justifications in ordinary common day parlance. Perhaps they did in the past.
It's a kind of forgotten fact of history almost that usury was prohibited in the Christian world until the 16th century. Henry VIII was one of the earliest examples of a king that permitted it basically in order to solve his financial problems. And he at that time it was called inter esse. There had been discussions by the scholastics in previous centuries. Thomas Aquinas was one of them. And these men had opined from a Christian legal perspective. So one of the arguments was that the bankers came with this many times in later centuries, was that interest is the price of money, or a rental of money. Now, I think to say interest is the price of money is just, it's almost like a straw man argument, because if I lend you £1,000 for £100 interest, then £100 is not the price of the £1,000. You have to pay me £1,100 back at the end of the year. So the £100 is not the price you pay for £1,000. The price you pay for £1,000 is £1,100. The interest is the profit markup, you could say, right? So interest is not the price of money. You could say it's the rental on money. And that's a much more common argument, that interest is like rent on money, right? The £100 is the rent you pay me for the use of the £1,000. Now, the scholastics addressed that quite early, about 800 years ago it was written about. And one of the arguments that's put forward by the scholastics is that if you rent a horse, I have a horse and you rent it from me, and you pay the rental for a day, and you go away and someone steals the horse through no fault of your own, who bears the loss of that theft? And the answer should be me, because I'm the owner of the horse, right? Okay, so you've rented the horse from me and you've paid me rental. It seems like a fair deal. You pay £1 to rent my horse for the day, to use my horse for the day. It's the price of using something. It's fine. Now, if interest is a rental on money, then let's say you borrow £100 from me at 10% interest, and you go away and someone steals that £100 from you. Whose loss is it? Right, you ask that question, and it's not mine. The bank will never say, "Oh, it's my loss. You had it nicked a hole up, mate." They won't say that, right? You are the one who bears the risk. So in that case, it means that you must be the owner of the money. This is the argument that scholastics made, right? So they said that,
it is pretty smart,
right? So they said interest cannot be a rental on the money, right? They said, if I give you £100 and you give me back some money, the only fair price for exchanging ownership is that which arises under a sale contract, because you own the money. Therefore, if you lose it, you bear the loss, which is fine. But then that must mean I sold you the money. I didn't rent it to you, I sold it to you. So the ownership transfers to you. And the only fair price for selling £1,000 or £100 or whatever is the same amount. I sell you £100 in return for £100. Right? There cannot be any extra. In other words, no interest. That was the scholastics argument, right? So
it's almost like saying 1 is 3 and 3 is 1, isn't it? It's almost like
in a sale contract, yes, to exchange. So I mean, the Islamic rule is very clear. If I sell you £1,000, the only price that's allowed, one which doesn't have usury, is to pay me £1,000 for it. But otherwise, why? So this was an early argument, and it's quite a strong one. But there came other arguments, and typically these came at the time when banks were growing. And so in the 17th century, there were many arguments justifying interest. And one of them I wrote about was the argument of Nassau Senior, who said that you get paid interest for abstaining. I could have spent this £100 on myself and had a nice dinner somewhere, or bought a house probably in those days. But I lent the money to you instead, and therefore I abstained from enjoying myself. And in compensation for this abstinence, you have to pay me to compensate me. Right?
Okay, yeah.
Now, this argument isn't around anymore, and probably because people realised that this very rich guy living in his country house, who had tens of thousands of pounds, he lent you 100. He wouldn't have to abstain from anything at all. Yeah, because he's still got this pile of money left.
Yeah,
So, but there were these, what I would class that as a kind of straw man argument alongside the price of money, argument.
And also it's completely false now because the banks print the money anyway, so it didn't exist prior to you requesting it from them.
Right, so now there are things that are put out regarding opportunity cost. There's nothing, the bank has got to think about its depositors' money. They can't just give it to you without interest. Well, actually, it's not true because there is no opportunity cost. You create the money out of nothing. Right? What's your cost of not doing that?
Yeah. There's no opportunity before you create it. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's just that you created the money from nothing, and you're telling me that, oh dear, I've suffered because you didn't pay interest as a borrower.
Yeah.
Well, if it cost you nothing to create that money, then the only fair deal to give that money to me is to give it to me at an interest rate of 0%.
Yeah.
So it costs me nothing to have it.
Yeah.
Right? So this opportunity cost argument doesn't wash.
Yeah.
Right? Given the nature of the system, but it's a very clever one because in other areas of life it definitely does apply.
Yeah.
Right? If I give you, my
your
Apple
car or whatever,
or my car, I can't use it. There's an opportunity cost. I couldn't use my car today because I lent it to you.
Yeah.
Right. So there are many arguments like this. The key one that probably remains standing is the time preference one, that nowadays, this is the one you will hear most frequently. It's the one you'll read on your MBA course. It's that now is better than later. Enjoying myself now is better than enjoying myself later. Having an apple today is better than having an apple tomorrow. And if I give up having an apple today, in return for an apple tomorrow, I want a little bit more of an apple tomorrow, an apple and a half tomorrow, for example, or next week or next year, right? And that's where this interest thing comes from, that compensation for giving up enjoyment today or having to wait, right? That now is better than later. Right. It's not quite the same as the abstinence argument. It's not that I'm giving it, it's that I'm having something later instead of now. I have questioned that. I think that there are many examples of where we don't prefer later, now to later. We may even prefer later to now in some cases. For example, holidays. Do you want to have your lifetime's worth of holidays this year, or do you want to have one holiday a year for the next 30 years? Do you want to have 7 breakfasts on Monday? Or do you want to have one on Monday, one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday? Right? Yeah. There are many examples where you are actually it's more sane as well as healthier to have consumption later than that. So I think that and of course, particularly on environmental issues, do we want to have a habitable planet in 300 years or not? We could say no, we'll give it all up. So then we'll consume now and pollute the planet, and who cares about 300 years?
You talk about this very well in your book, The Problem of Interest, with respect to the use of farming and farmland.
Right.
And how overuse of farmland destroys the land for all future generations, but how actually interest incentivizes
to do exactly
specifically the destruction of land.
It does, yes.
For future use. There seems to be, to my mind, the way you're speaking, you're talking about apples as well, and that brought to mind something you mentioned in your book about the very nature of money. And that ties in well with the justifications for interest, because they talk about interest, and the justifications for interest presume that money is in a separate class of its own, separate to all the other commodities in existence. So, one point you make in your book is that if if you use apples for currency, your apples rot. Okay. If you use most things in terms of which are commodities, they eventually degenerate. But money is electronic now, and it was paper. With an interest-based system, not only does it not decompose over time, it actually reproduces itself. And so this, in a way, we've already discussed this to some extent. Is that really the heart of it? Really, why ultimately, when you have the production of more money, you need the production of more goods and services, which ultimately bankrupt society. And would you therefore say that the correct way of viewing society, or the best way of viewing money, is actually a system of money which actually decomposes over time? And I guess this is getting into the Islamic question. What is the Islamic conception of money? And can you speak to that?
I think the issue that I've raised on the rotting of real wealth, for example, apples is one of the more extreme examples, but even permanent things that we think permanent, like houses, they rot over centuries.
Yeah, require maintenance.
They require maintenance. And what I've argued is that the financial system should reflect that fact to some degree. Now, if you have an interest-based system, you borrow 100,000 to buy a flat or 500,000 to buy a house. The thing you've bought with the 500,000, the thing you've bought gradually decomposes over time. Is much more obvious with cars, for example, and much more obvious with food. But the thing you've bought decomposes over time. But the money balance that you use to buy those things increases at interest. And I said that this is a contradiction. And many others have made this point, actually. I'm not the first to make it.
Margaret Kennedy made it very well.
Margaret Kennedy, Frederick Soddy, people who were well known in English science, typically engineers by background. They asked this question, that the rule towards increasing disorder, that entropy increases, applies to the whole physical world, but not to money. Money can just continue growing at compound interest as if there's some kind of miracle. And the two should somehow equate. Now, the reason I made that point is that it's very well known in Islamic law that money suffers decrement. Yeah. Not compound increment, but decrement.
Yeah.
Compound decrement, in fact, under what we call zakah, the wealth tax at 2.5%. And that just strikes me as not a coincidence, because then you have a financial system which, to some degree, instead of growing like some cancer out of control at compound interest, actually reflects what's going on in the real world.
Because the point of money is to reflect goods and assets, fundamentally.
Yes, it's tying the financial sector to the real sector, you see. So it's just another way of looking at this. Yeah. The financial sector that we want is one which reflects the interests, again, in the political sense, and the realities, physical realities as well as economic and social realities of the real world. And this system of interest charges that we have contradicts that completely. It does not reflect the reality of the real world.
To the profit of one class and to the detriment of everyone else.
To the detriment of everyone else.